Welcome to the Pamastay Podcast. We are a podcast focused on informing families on what it is to age gracefully and get a preview into issues they may need to prepare for. I'm Ashwini, and this is my co-host Erin, and we're looking at things like long-term care insurance, deprescribing, end-of-life conversations, and cardiac care. Topics that matter to you and the people you care about today.
I'm very excited to have a fellow Stanford alum on the podcast. Lisa Blackstock has contributed to multiple sources. She was recently on a Consumer Reports article and has other work coming out. She is a Soul Sherpa and has a business to be a healthcare advocate for folks. And today we're going to focus on long-term care insurance with her to learn about that space and the decisions that we need to make as we're expecting to age longer for ourselves and our family members. Lisa, I'd love to have you introduce yourself to our listeners a little bit before we get into things, and also introduce your story too, and what brought you to where you are today and helping so many with the difficult bureaucracies that we encounter as we get older.
The short answer is a hole in my head. And but to elaborate on that, first I want to thank you, Erin, and thank you, Ashwini, for this kind invitation to be able to appear on your podcast. I appreciate it. And I especially feel passionately that this is a subject that not enough people give a lot of pre-thought to, because no one really wants to think about aging and being limited in their physical or emotional independence. But the reality is that that is life, and we are living longer, and it is getting more expensive to live in our later years. I came to this space quite accidentally. I literally had a craniotomy in 2007 at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles to correct a rare nerve disorder called trigeminal neuralgia that causes unpredictable and frequent electrical shocks in your face. I woke up in the middle of the night one night at 46 years old, shocked, literally on the left side of my face. I had no idea what it was. I had been in very good health. Just a few months prior, my husband and I had hiked to the top of Mount Whitney in a single day. And needless to say, I went through an ordeal that was horrific and unexpected. I had no idea it would end up in major brain surgery. My initial treatment, which lasted a few months, dentists and endodontists focused on my mouth. And I had 5 root canals that I did not need. And the pain did not get any better. And prior to this point, I had been working as an estate administrator in West Los Angeles with a company that I had founded in 1990. I was doing quite well and was well established and really enjoyed working with my older clients. They were exclusively the senior population. They had health issues, as anyone aging would, ranging from not so complicated things to very complicated and end of life. And as an adjunct courtesy service to my estate administration, I worked as their healthcare advocate without really knowing that had a title. But that's how I first became familiar with the space: medical insurance, long-term care insurance, hospitalizations, discharges, medical appointments, prescriptions, things like that. But after I went through my own health ordeal, where I was finally correctly diagnosed at the UCLA School of Dentistry, where they have a smaller practice there called the Oral Facial Pain Clinic, that was where I was finally correctly diagnosed after all of these unnecessary root canals and removal of a permanent tooth. I found out that the issue was not in my face at all. It was at my brain stem, where your cranial nerves lie horizontally. My fifth cranial nerve, I believe it's the fifth cranial nerve is called the trigeminal nerve, which runs in 3 branches on each side of your face, your upper and lower jaw, and your forehead. And I was being shocked electrically because my left trigeminal nerve was being compressed by an artery pumping blood to my brain. So if you have your nerves laying this way, this artery, which was vertical, every time it compressed to pump blood up into my brain, it got tangled up in my left trigeminal nerve until it wore away all of the protective coating on my nerve, which is called myelin sheath, until it was literally compressing and squeezing a raw nerve without any protection. And every time that happened, which was about 50 times a minute, my left trigeminal nerve would send misfiring signals to my face. And that's when I felt an electric shock. So it was going through that misdiagnosis, proper diagnosis, getting cleared by my insurer. Now, and this was now in 2007, prior to the passage of the Affordable Care Act, where I was still stymied by a good PPO insurer refusing to cover an out-of-network neurosurgeon, who was the only person in Los Angeles at that time who was very well-versed in performing this procedure. I was not going to go through brain surgery with someone in network just for the sake of staying in network. So I did appeal with my insurer. I think being surrounded by a lot of good attorneys as an estate administrator, I learned how to write an effective appeal, which I learned you never appeal verbally over the telephone. You always do it in writing. You document everything, because being on the telephone with a supposed knowledgeable representative for a healthcare provider or a healthcare insurer does not guarantee anything. Everything needs to be in writing. When I recovered from my brain surgery, which took almost a year, it was at that point that I decided to change my focus. And again, the Affordable Care Act had not passed yet in March of 2010. And it was only around that time that private patient advocates or private healthcare advocates came into the lexicon and into practice. I was practicing, kind of on my own in my own unique space, and only discovered with the passage of the Affordable Care Act that there was a small and still relatively small community of private healthcare advocates. And I segued into that space. I still provide estate consultation in a field that I'll call life care planning, which incorporates your medical care, your advanced care planning, all different types of insurances, financial planning, including your power of attorney, making sure, a lot of people don't know, but the Social Security Administration does not recognize a power of attorney. They have their own special form, the SSA, I believe it's the 1969 or 1696, called SSA power of appointment. And also legally, people do not have wills, they don't have trusts, they don't understand that even if they have those, it's generally their responsibility to vest their assets in their trust, which means titling them. But part of this life care planning is long-term care insurance. Medical insurance, even the best medical insurance, is not an indefinite policy. There is a benefit clock that runs on every insurance plan, including Medicare. A lot of people don't realize that Medicare will provide you, and most insurances, the rule of thumb is 100 consecutive days of coverage, either in a hospital or a rehab facility. And a lot of people are shocked to learn that after that, they are completely on their own. If they do have a long-term care policy, which is specifically what we're going to be talking about today, they always must satisfy what's called an exclusionary, or there's another word for it that's escaping my mind, but an elimination period. That period is generally 90 days, which is 3 months, where even before a person can expect their long-term insurer to pay, assuming you get your claim approved first time around, which is becoming more and more difficult, you are out of pocket for 3 months for whatever care you need, whether you're in a skilled nursing facility, still getting PT, OT, occupational therapy, or speech therapy, or if you're home and simply need a caregiver. So it's extremely important, especially what I have found working with very good estate attorneys, is their primary focus tends to be on concentrating wealth among families and passing on assets at the most favorable tax basis possible. And I understand that, and that has a place, but I really don't find very many estate attorneys who are, number one, comfortable talking about people losing their independence and, heaven forbid, even entering hospice. It's very uncomfortable for them in general. And they don't really understand the finer points of what it takes to qualify for a long-term care policy, when you need to apply, what you're looking for, and how the application process is really filled with a lot of bumps and really things that can trip you up that they just don't know, because they generally do not practice in this field.
I think all of the context that we have, not everyone has. So just as a moment for some background, we have a labor shortage as we get older for who's going to care for folks, both from an accredited perspective and people who have licenses. We're talking about nurses and MDs and other folks, all the way to people who provide things like non-accredited or non-licensed care, like more informal caregivers for activities of daily living or even housekeeping and those kinds of things. One thing that I struggled with until my parents told me that they had long-term care insurance. One thing I struggled with was, well, why? Like, I didn't understand, why do you need it? Like, what is this, what is going on that you might need long-term care insurance? Why might I even look to get long-term care insurance? And particularly in our generation, millennials, Gen Z, Gen X, Gen Y, like talking to parents too, what are the things that we should approach people with to say, hey, these are some reasons why we might want to start having this conversation around long-term care insurance. You might not know this, but this is why you need to start looking at these costs. There's some other dynamics at play. It would be helpful for you to walk us through.
Yeah, it's really quite complicated. And if it weren't for the fact that I worked in this arena and have worked on some level since 1990, it would be impossible for me to understand the ins and outs, what the definition of certain things. For example, I've helped clients qualify for their long-term care coverage, and in that process have discovered that several of these plans, and there are as many different plans, as there are different kinds of mortgages. So people need to be very astute and understand when they're shopping that it's not a one-size-fits-all plan with coverage. I have encountered clients and their loved ones trying to be approved for coverage where they have found out that if they have an informal caregiver who can be a family friend, a family member, someone who was recommended by a friend, who does not work for a licensed agency, where those caregivers are known as formal caregivers, where the agency pays their federal and state income tax, they handle that withholding, disability insurance. A lot of long-term care plans will specifically exclude coverage for an informal caregiver, which is, I mean, people don't know that when they are buying a policy, as you're buying anything, you're buying any kind of home insurance, auto insurance, medical insurance, the agent who is selling you that plan, they are a salesperson. And there's nothing wrong with that. But the burden is on us to ask the detailed questions or to consult with someone who can help them understand what it is they need to ask specifically. A lot of people don't know that there is a huge distinction and can make the difference in whether a long-term policy is really useful or not by purchasing an additional waiver on the plan, which is known as an inflationary waiver, which increases in value every year, just like Social Security benefits go up every year. There is an inflationary waiver that is expensive, and not all people can afford it. And some people think, well, that's just an extra added thing that I don't need. I'm just going to buy the basic policy because that's more affordable, only to find out 10 or 20 or 30 years later that the face value for which they were insured decades ago is the actual value of what that's going to pay today, provided they clear the claims process. And you know, what used to be $5,000 today on a monthly coverage basis is really very little. And I can only imagine when I'm 80 or 85 years old, hopefully, if I do need this coverage, and obviously none of us want to need it. We don't want to, but the reality is things happen. I had major brain surgery at 46 years old when I had, hiked a 14,496-foot mountain in one day. And 3 months later, I literally could not get out of bed because the pain was so excruciating. Things happen.
I think it's really hard to come to the conclusion that we need long-term care insurance when we're also navigating things like HSAs and 529 plans and all these other kinds of savings vehicles or preparation vehicles or insurance vehicles or accounts for our families. I mean, I think taking a moment around the costs associated with aging in our 80s and 90s is really meaningful. We can be looking at $60,000, $80,000 a year in today's dollars for people helping, coming to us, or $100,000 to $150,000 to $200,000 a year if we're in a nursing home or somewhere else. So I think there's this concept of, like, unfortunately, having to think about this as a hedge. So long-term care insurance might not actually be available or even possible for some people, and it would be possible for others. Do you have a perspective on that at all?
Well, I do. And I can say that in all the decades that I've been in this space, because people are living longer and because non-medical care is becoming more and more expensive. And statistically, the longer you age, the greater the likelihood that you're going to need this coverage. The number of carriers that provide the better plans that I saw 20 and 30 years ago are no longer offering those plans. There was a great plan. I don't want to mention any companies because I'm not here to endorse or not endorse anyone. but there was a very good plan that was available 40 years ago where it cost $250,000 up front. The entire premium was due up front. It was a one-time payment. It guaranteed a person with an inflationary waiver that that coverage was good for whatever place and whatever type of care they needed. And when that person passed away, they were required initially to name a beneficiary of the policy. And when the person receiving the care passed away, the beneficiary of the policy received the full $250,000 premium. Now, of course, the insurance company had 10 or 20 or 30 years to invest that money and still come out ahead. But basically, the premium was nothing out of pocket. Yes, you lost investing $250,000 for the period of the person's lifetime, but you can't buy those plans anymore. And the other issue is there is a shortage now. I mean, it really started with COVID, but it has continued. People who work as caregivers, whether they are formal or informal caregivers, their work is so underrated and they are so underpaid that a lot of people deliberately choose not to go into this field. They'll go on to a website where they can advertise their own services, set their own hourly rate, be responsible for their own taxes and disability insurance. And I can tell you that the best caregivers that I have found for my clients, or they have found with referrals, are on-site websites where it's not an agency, but people will provide their own listing, provide their own background check, provide references, DMV checks, and they run much more expensive, depending upon the part of the country that you're in, than an agency or an informal caregiver. But what you get can be invaluable. You can get a driver. You can get someone to help you pay your bills, someone to help you go grocery shopping, someone to help you maintain your home. There are all different levels of caregivers, from the very basic to people who are almost like caregiver hybrid personal assistants. And people, I think, need to think in this society where anti-aging is glorified to the point where I really think that it is unhealthy. Not only is it unrealistic, but it is unhealthy, because people will focus on anti-aging and Botox and plastic surgery and gyms in their homes and personal trainers. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but I think that it needs to be kept in perspective. And you are going to age, and if you're lucky enough to get old and live, your anti-aging regimen is not going to help you when you need care. Your personal trainer is not going to be transferring you from your bed into a wheelchair. It's not going to happen. Your Botox is not going to help you.
I think we try to talk about that in a couple other of these podcasts, where some conversations are really challenging. We talked to a hospice chaplain in one of our conversations. We talked about the need to, rebalance, our pharmaceutical drugs too, every year, like do a check-in with your doctor. Like, don't get stuck in, a specific frame of mind and this specific thing, right? You got to like check in and kind of rebalance that stuff. So before this conversation, I prepared by trying to look at long-term care insurance policies for myself, and it was a disaster. I couldn't find a place. And if you're listening and you have a place and you want to send it to us, please do send it to a podcast at pamastay.com. But I could not find a place that gave me a bunch of different side-by-side options on long-term care insurance for me. And so I talked to my parents about it. And apparently, when they signed up for their long-term care insurance policy, they looked online and they got a policy from one broker, um, through one company. So they were shopping different policies that were summarized, but the decision set that they had was like through the place that they ended up buying, right? It was like through that insurer. They never had a chance or an opportunity or took the time to look across multiple insurers.
Mhm.
It's hard to take the time to do that, but do you have some suggestions around on like the importance of this decision and how to help navigate, the decision around how to actually choose an appropriate long-term care insurance plan?
Yeah, well, first, summary of benefits. A summary of benefits is not your actual policy, the legal contract that you are buying. And as I recommend with healthcare plans, and now I know the Affordable Care Act plans are going to be rolling out on Friday, I believe, November 1st. And people will be looking at summary of benefits. Summary of benefits. Nobody likes them. They're boring. People focus on what's my premium, my monthly premium, my deductible, my copay, my maximum out of pocket for in and out of network. That does not tell you everything that you need to know. I never will assess whether they're medical insurance plans or long-term care policies. I request a copy of the entire policy and I review it. And they are boring and they are legalese. They are a lot of boilerplate. But when push comes to shove and it comes down to your coverage, if you don't understand that policy or hire someone to read that policy for you and summarize in writing what the high points are, what the low points are, and things that you need to clarify, that in my opinion is a huge mistake that most people make, because it's not exciting work. It really isn't. But if you talk to someone who is knowledgeable, reviewing these plans, most of it is boilerplate and doesn't really matter. But the words and, or, and if, and only are very important and can make or break the value of a plan. So, number one, I understand the job of a broker. There is a place for brokers. I've known an excellent broker in Southern California who is very transparent, and because she is, she gets a lot of business. But the brokers are like people who sell automobiles and people who sell houses and everything else. You've got the bell curve. You have some on the high end who are extremely good and very thorough. But as with the bell curve, you have an average of people, in the middle who are, middle helpful. And then you have the low end of the bell curve, just like every profession, where some people just are not very good at what they do. And it's extremely important for the public to realize that there's nothing wrong with sales positions at all, but you need to be savvy and you need to understand that you are ultimately responsible for doing your shopping and your due diligence. And you need to check references on a broker. You need to make sure they're licensed. You need to make sure that there haven't been any complaints filed with them. Depending upon the state in the country where a person lives, you can check with the a state insurance commissioner. There are some states where I check with the state attorney general, with the Better Business Bureau. You really need to be, as thoughtful as people are today, shopping for preschools for their kids. They'll put them on waiting lists. They'll take tours for preschool. And the same for elementary school and the whole college application process. I mean, people will travel the country. People generally do not do this when it comes to long-term care insurance or even health insurance. But if you don't, you need to realize that when you are, or when your loved one is in a position where you need this policy to go into effect for you, you are not going to be feeling great and at the top of your game. And you may even be intellectually diminished to a certain extent. It's too late.
Lisa, that was such an incredible visualization. I'm so grateful that you said it that way. The way, the college application process, and some people don't even go to college or can't go to college or choose another path, or like choosing like a school to go to, whatever that is. Choosing a long-term care insurance policy is a decision that is that meaningful, because there are hundreds of thousands of dollars at stake to millions of dollars at stake.
Well, I mean, you could almost argue that it's more meaningful because you are not that bright-eyed 17 or 18-year-old with parents who are, for the most part, still very healthy and aware. And it's not because you've done anything wrong, it's because you're aging, which is a normal, natural thing.
At the age of 65, a lot of our listeners will be considering transitioning, of course, to Medicare. Most of our listeners are probably familiar with that requirement. If you're not at the age of 65, you will need to go to Medicare. You have about 7 months to sign up. What are some other forms of insurance, or some reasons why people should consider other forms of insurance? The reason I'm saying that is my understanding is long-term care insurance is necessary in addition to Medicare. And I don't think many people are aware of what long-term care insurance actually is, what it's able to compensate, and what you can actually get reimbursed through long-term care insurance, and perhaps what other types of insurance they might need to consider when they are doing that insurance audit at the age of 65, if not earlier.
Well, I'm in that group right now. I'm going to be 65 in 4.5 months. And you referred to the 7-month period to enroll in Medicare, which is correct. But that 7-month period is a very specific period. It's the month that you turn 65, 3 months prior to that, and 3 months after that. And if you miss, a lot of people, these terms are so confusing. But if you don't understand what makes up an open enrollment period for Medicare, if you go to sign up 5 months after you turn 65, you're going to be penalized. And in some cases, you may not, depending, a lot of people don't understand the difference between traditional Medicare A and B and Medicare Advantage. It is incredibly complicated. And I have learned this not because I found it in any single source. That would be too easy. I've learned this by doing this long time ago by helping estate clients. I remember I was an estate administrator when Medicare Part D, which covered prescription drugs, became a new plan. And there was so much confusion and so little independent source that you could go to, not trying to steer people one way or the other to anything. It's also important, and I think that your audience should know that when we're talking about healthcare advocacy or life care planning, we, as professionals, we are not allowed to accept commissions from any insurance company, any long-term care company, any assisted living facility. That's part of our code of ethics, that we cannot do that. And if a person in my field of work is caught doing that, there are consequences, because our job is to be an independent, unbiased source of accurate information, and not trying to steer a client toward one thing or another because we get a commission. And I think it's very important. Look, people who sell policies, I analyze them. I don't sell them, and I consult. I have no problem with a salesperson earning a commission, but people need to understand what the role of a salesperson is versus the role of an independent consultant who can, without being swayed by any kind of motivation other than what our regular hourly or project fee is, explain the nuts and bolts and break down the policy and not the explanation of benefits. But yes, look, a lot of people prior to Medicare will start looking into long-term care because it's less expensive. And I predict that as we live longer because medical care is better. There are a large segment of people who are taking better care of themselves earlier on in life. I think that it's reasonable to expect that as longevity continues to extend itself, policies are going to become more restrictive because no insurance company of any kind, and this applies to long-term care, no insurance company goes into business to lose money. People are in business to make money, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But you've got to be a savvy analyzer or have a savvy analyzer to help you understand what these policies are truly all about, because the summary of benefits does not cover it by a long shot.
I think that's right. I think Ashwini is trying to get to this point where Medicare is oriented toward doctor's visits and health, where long-term care insurance is oriented toward very expensive other types of things like
care.
Like
care,
people helping with activities of daily living, non-medical care, the costs of labor associated with getting people to your house to manage you, or wherever you may be. It could also be related to that gap. So you're talking about how Medicare will provide coverage up to potentially 100 days, right? So there are Medicare terms that will allow for reimbursement depending on the Medicare policies that cover you to 100 days. But after that 100-day period of time, if you still need care, now you're starting to talk about out-of-pocket payments. And you can imagine if you're in a situation where you're still needing care at 100 days, you can imagine that you're in a bad spot. Because if you need care after 100 days and you still need care, that's going to be expensive care. And that is where now you are paying out of pocket. And if you don't have something to cover you there, that's where we're talking about a hedge to preserve wealth. What I mean by that is, say you have a $2 or $3 million home, you've been lucky enough to do that, you've been privileged enough to do that, you have that home. Well, now if you're going to have 200 or 300 more days of care, and you don't have any other accounts or any other savings, you're going to have to start thinking about that house, which is a terrible thing. Right. But if you had a long-term care insurance policy that you were paying into, you wouldn't have to think about that house. So the trade-off here is like, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to spend $100,000, $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 on care that I might not need, but I might be able to preserve this $3 million house. Where it's a privileged conversation to be even able to weigh those trade-offs. I don't know if long-term care insurance is really going to be useful to someone necessarily who's only on Social Security and doesn't have pension. It's a different type of conversation because of how expensive it is. But to preserve, if you're interested in legacy, if you're fortunate enough to talk about legacy or that kind of thing, it's a really important part of preserving that.
Exactly. I think a couple other notes there. I mean, I called a bunch of senior residences about a month ago, and some of them take long-term care insurance. I think another thing to consider here as well is when you get long-term care insurance. The older you are, when you consider it, the more expensive it will be. I was talking to a wonderful 89-year-old woman who didn't have long-term care insurance, and I just got in out of the hospital. I actually helped her fill out her hospital survey, and she was sharing with me that she had only purchased long-term care insurance 5 years prior, and her premium was quite expensive. She didn't have it before. Additionally, I recently learned with Medi-Cal, some of these, care treatments can be covered under Medi-Cal if you are under a certain earning line. So it's something to consider. If long-term care insurance is not something that makes sense for you and your family. If you do qualify for Medi-Cal, I highly suggest taking Lisa's guidance and reading everything in depth and seeing what you actually have coverage for.
Yes, it's important to Medi-Cal is the Medicaid version of healthcare in the state of California. In the rest of the country, it's Medicaid. It's important. Yes, people can get help. People can get help at home, but you cannot get full-time care through Medicaid. It's maybe extremely rare circumstances that most people won't qualify for, maybe somebody with MS or ALS, but in general, you cannot get, that many hours. It's expensive. And there is a process to qualify for Medicaid. And even though it is true that a person can own a home and a vehicle, if you make more in general, if you make more than 2,000, have income of more than $2,000 a month as a single person, or $3,000 a month as a couple, then the only way you can get that coverage is to engage in what's called a spend down process, where we went through this with my mom earlier this year. Her monthly income was about $8,000 a month. But we were exploring all different kinds of care options because she did not purchase long-term care insurance. And in order for her to receive Medicaid help through the state of Connecticut, she had to give $3,800 of her monthly income into the program. But a lot of people don't even understand the spend down program. So many people will go to a financial advisor for their long-term planning, and they'll go to an estate attorney, even if it's just for a simple thing like a will, and a last will and testament, or maybe added to a trust. People, I believe, with what I'm seeing, really need to incorporate their whole life when they look at that. Financial planners come to me. Attorneys come to me. They do not understand what these little ins and outs of healthcare and longevity and sickness and prescription medications. They just don't understand it. It's not their job. My business, which is called Soul Sherpa, which it's a trademark name that I came up with long before I became a healthcare advocate. When I was working as an estate administrator, I volunteered as a hospice and palliative care counselor. And I came up with that name, SOUL, because that's the essence of who you are, your soul, your spirit. And Sherpa, who is a hiking guide, and the fact that I'm a high altitude hiker, I had that trademarked by my wonderful personal attorney, who had the insight to think of this a long time ago, in the fields of education, of aging, and healthcare. And I had no conception at that time that I would undergo a life-changing experience of major brain surgery without having. My husband and I had been married for over a dozen years at that point, but we did not have healthcare directives. We did not have estate plans, but that circumstance forced us to have to do that. And I can't tell you how many people come to me only after a problem has arisen and they have none of these documents. And I was just as guilty as so many people who come to me now. I was feeling great. I was living great. Work was great. I loved my life. And I just didn't give a thought to 30, 40, 50, 60 years down the road. It never occurred to me.
We like to wrap up our podcast with, if you had 60 seconds to encourage people to do something, what would that thing be to pay yourself forward? But it seems to me there's an opportunity to create like some milestone birthdays for people and for couples to
Mhm.
sort out affairs in like a celebratory way. Like, hey, going to college is a really big deal. Getting your first job is a big deal. Figure out your long-term care insurance policy and your, advanced medical directive for your 49th birthday. Like, take
Mhm.
60 seconds now to put a placeholder weekend and go on a retreat with a checklist that you can get. Visit Lisa's website. Figure some stuff out when you turn 49, so that the second half of your life, God willing, you live another 50-40 years, you're set and you've given it time. I think the other thing too is like, we don't it's hard to conceive of living for 50 more years at 50, right? Like so much has already been done. We've already done so much stuff. We've gone through so many stages of life, and that we're just halfway done. Like, that's wild. I mean, like, honestly, like that, I remember puberty. I wasn't great. You know what I mean? Like, so like what's coming up? You know what I mean? Like that, it's, there's, so how can we honor that by doing some prep work before, over
Well,
the course of a couple weekends?
people will, they used to have bachelor and bachelorette parties or engagement parties. They've turned into weekend getaways. You know, I don't know why there just can't be, a guarantee your future weekend, or even a part. People throw Botox parties. I mean, it's insane. Why don't it doesn't I can tell you, after going through the process, it's not that bad. The benefit of doing it is, once you do it, you put your copy in a safe deposit box or with your attorney. You give your designated agents copies, and then you forget about it, and then you go back to living fully. So my 60 seconds of advice is, wherever are now, regardless of your age, your socioeconomic status, your education level, your life is valuable. You are valuable. Make sure that you're living the kind of life that is as rewarding to you as it can be, and live in the present, but plan for the future. Don't obsess about it. Don't dwell on it, because you know what, it's going to happen whether we like it or not. But the great benefit that I see in making sure that all your ducks are in a row is that you don't have to worry about it. You literally can live the rest of your life on autopilot. For me, brain surgery was such a gift once I recovered from a horrifically painful experience, as well as depressing. Um, it is such a gift because it's made me live so much more deliberately and be so grateful that I can get up in the morning and not have any ache or pain or headache, and do pretty much whatever I want physically, and help people. And an important thing I'd like to add is that, if by default people choose not to do this because it's either too depressing or it's morbid, someone will make the decision for you in the future. Whether it's your spouse or a partner or an adult child or a close friend or a doctor. I don't want, as much as I love and trust people in my life, I want to be the captain of my ship. And I do not want people making those decisions for me. I've seen many people who go into the hospital, they're unable to communicate, their loved ones do not know what they want. And a lot of times, their insurance or lack of it, combined with medical advice, the decision is made. And to me, that's a very scary thing.
I love that. And Lisa, I also personally, I'm very grateful for some language that you've given us today. A quick aside, that in some of the conversations we've been having, Ashwini and I have been circling around this issue that, we as individuals have life cycles. Like, people, we get born, we grow, we wither, we die, but our families have life cycles too. So like, our families, we're part of a family group, a family that we're legally bound to, or blood bound to, emotionally bound to, families we choose. But there's a
Mhm.
life cycle to that group, that family, and it changes and it evolves. And something that you provided for me today that I'm grateful for is the stakes of some of these decisions, they're very meaningful. They're as meaningful as the decisions that you had when you were 12 and someone said you need to start like getting better grades or practicing on this thing for high school. And they're as meaningful as, hey, this high school stuff is coming up and you got to make sure that it's set for college or this profession that you're doing. Or, hey, it's time to figure out what you're going to do professionally. And you get on those tracks in our 20s and our 30s and our 40s. But there are other things really important that are in our 50s and our 60s and our 70s and our 80s.
And after seeing so many negative situations where things happen to people that they didn't want or they would not have chosen, to me, it makes absolutely no sense to leave your fate to chance.
That is a wonderful note to end on. It doesn't make sense to leave your fate to chance. Own it and see it through and have the courage to do that. Lisa, thank you so much for being a guest with us today. I know that
My pleasure. My great pleasure. Thank you.
I appreciate you being so open with our listeners. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been my privilege to be your guest, and I appreciate it. And hopefully some people a lot of people will benefit from this. It's so important, but I'm very grateful for the opportunity. Thanks very much to both of you.
Thanks, Lisa.
Okay, it's just the two of us. Let's chat. Lisa's focus on encouraging us to quote unquote adult cannot be understated. There are so many aspects of just adulthood and aging that are not too glamorous. That comes with, paying your credit card bills and managing your budgets, but also scales all the way to the types of insurance policies you choose to purchase, and educating yourself on all of those different aspects of quote unquote adulting. And I think we overlook that sometimes, perhaps when we become parents and are responsible for other people in our lives, we neglect ourselves in many different ways. What really stood out to me from what Lisa was sharing was, and I know this really resonated with you, was just that she compared it to going to college. She compared it to big life milestones. Preparing to age is absolutely one of those that we need to take into consideration here, and we need to make sure we're educated on.
I think something that we should work on for our listeners, just as a service that people can refer to, is some milestone markers of important decisions to make and when can be appropriate to make them. One of I agree with you. This takeaway that I had was not even just aging, was like literally just the decision to buy a long-term care insurance policy and what that actually means and why you need to, and the gap associated with it, or why it might not be good for you and why you might rely on Medicaid services instead. I think creating that map, particularly as we navigate the years from 40 to 60, could be very useful for folks. We didn't get a chance to cover the fact that once you get to 70 or 80 years old, it's actually more and more unlikely that you'll even be approved for a long-term care insurance policy. So the premiums are very high, but even getting approved is almost impossible once you get to 80 years old. So if you're living to 80 and you're doing great at 80, you're like, oh my God, I might hit 100. I've got 20 more years. You might not be able to get insurance at that point. And that's 20 years. Great, thoughtful conversation, a really good day. Lisa's an incredible human. Thanks for listening. We'll see you in the next episode. Ashwini, as always, it's a pleasure to be building with you. So you're great. You're awesome. You've always been great. That'll always be true.
I will see you all very soon. Thank you for listening.